Imagine a world, right? Advanced civilizations, powerful empires, these bustling trade networks, and then suddenly, dramatically, it all just unravels, almost simultaneously. Cities burn, writing systems vanish, rulers fall. It leaves behind, well, centuries of silence, really. It sounds like fiction, but this is real history. This is the Bronze Age collapse. Today, we're doing a deep dive into this transformative period. We're zeroing in on those tumultuous years, roughly 1200 to 1100 BCE. It was a genuine historical breaking point. It shook the foundations, the very bedrock of societies across the Eastern Mediterranean. We're talking about the collapse of what was essentially an ancient globalized system, long before we even had the word for it.
Exactly. And our mission here, is to go way beyond just a simple explanation. We really want to unpack the multi-layered causes behind this collapse. We need to look at the role of those, well, enigmatic sea peoples, always a point of debate, that one. And crucially, what lessons this ancient crisis might hold for us today. We'll be digging into the sources you've provided, looking really closely at how incredibly interconnected these ancient societies were, and how it wasn't just one thing, but a whole tangle of factors that led to their, well, almost simultaneous downfall. It's a fascinating and, frankly, a pretty sobering look at how fragile even complex systems can be when multiple pressures hit at once.
Okay, so let's set the scene then. Before everything went dark, what did this world actually look like, this interconnected world? Who are the main players? How did they, interact? Because our sources paint this picture of the Eastern Mediterranean as this vibrant tapestry, right? Mosaic of really sophisticated civilizations, all kind of operating at their peak. We're talking complex states, advanced tech, deep cultural interaction. You've got the Mycenaean palaces in Greece, the huge new kingdom of Egypt. It sounds like this grand, intricate machine.
Oh, yeah.
Almost like a superorganism of empires.
It really was a historical high point for human organization, cultural achievement. Think of it, yeah, like the original globalized world, just on a regional scale. Let's maybe sketch out the main players, because understanding their strengths and their eventual weaknesses is really key.
Good idea. Lay it out for us.
Okay, so starting in Greece, across the peninsula, you have the Mycenaeans. They'd set up this network of really powerful city-states. But these weren't just cities. They were these sprawling palace centers that Mycena, Pylos, Tiryns, famous not just as royal homes, but as sophisticated administrative hubs, economic centers.
So the palace was like the central computer managing everything.
Pretty much. Imagine one palace controlling huge territories, managing agriculture, organizing massive bronze production. They were very bureaucratic. They used this unique script, linear B, hundreds of signs, quite complex for managing everything, recording tribute, troop movements, detailed trade inventories, and their society, dominated by a pretty formidable warrior aristocracy. They were the top dogs in the Aegean, militarily and politically.
Okay, Mycenaeans in Greece. Got it. Moving east.
Moving east into Anatolia, modern Turkey, you find the colossal Hittite Empire. This was a vast kingdom, known for its strong military, obviously, but also, maybe surprisingly, for really advanced diplomacy. Masters of international treaties, alliances.
Really? Treaties back then?
Oh yeah, complex ones, formal documents, outlining responsibilities, mutual defense pacts. They were a major player, strong enough to go toe-to-toe with Egypt. You know, the famous Battle of Kadesh?
Ah, yes, Kadesh. Okay, so the Hittites in Anatolia and Egypt.
And speaking of Egyptians, during their New Kingdom period, especially under pharaohs like Ramesses II, Ramesses III, they were absolutely at their peak. Political strength, military might. Their state structure was incredibly organized, a central bureaucracy managing vast resources, and this powerful army projecting influence way beyond the Nile Valley into the Levant, into Nubia. Their wealth, from the Nile, from trade, their cultural influence, it was massive. They set the standard for luxury, for monumental building.
Right. And then along the coast.
The Levant.
Along the Levant coast, modern Lebanon, Syria, Israel, you have the Phoenicians. Now, they weren't a single empire like Egypt or the Hittites. They were more a collection of powerful, independent city-states. Think Ugarit, Tyre.
What made them stand out was their role in sea trade. Pioneers of maritime culture. Daring sailors, master shipbuilders, setting up trade routes all across the Med, and crucially, they developed this revolutionary alphabetic writing system, a much simpler phonetic script. It's actually the precursor to many modern alphabets, ours included.
Wow, the alphabet, that's huge.
It really is. Speaks volumes about their practical innovation, their reach.
Okay, so Phoenicians in the Levant. anyone else crucial.
Absolutely. We can't forget Cyprus and also key North Syrian cities like Ugarit, which we mentioned. These were vital hubs, crossroads for trade, for cultural exchange. Cyprus, especially, was strategically massive because of its copper. Loads of copper.
And copper means bronze.
Exactly. Copper plus tin equals bronze, the metal that defined the age. So these centers were where goods, ideas, people from all these big powers mixed, a truly ancient global marketplace.
What strikes me here, digging into this, is how connected they all were. These weren't isolated powers just doing their own thing. The sources detail this really complex web of relationships. It wasn't just a bunch of strong states existing side by side. It feels like a truly interdependent system. You called it an ancient global economy, and that feels right.
That's precisely it. And that's where you see the genius and, ironically, the ultimate vulnerability of the Bronze Age. These civilizations relied heavily on each other, especially for essential raw materials. This created a delicate economic web. Bronze, right? The foundation of their tech, their military. It needs copper and tin.
Right, you mentioned copper from Cyprus. What about tin?
Tin was the real bottleneck. Copper was relatively available, Cyprus, Anatolia. But tin, incredibly scarce across the eastern Mediterranean. Our sources suggest tin had to be imported from really distant lands. Thousands of miles, maybe from Afghanistan, possibly even parts of Europe, like Cornwall.
Wow. Afghanistan to Greece for tin. That's a supply chain.
A very long, very fragile supply chain, stretching across continents just to get that essential ingredient to the workshops. And this trade network wasn't just metals, it moved finished goods, too. Olive oil from the Aegean, wine from the Levant, fancy textiles from Egypt, luxury stuff like ivory, gold, all circulating. Imagine this delicate balance of supply and demand. If one part gets disrupted, a tin mine dries up, a trade route gets blocked by, say, pirates. It sends shockwaves through the whole system. It affects everything. Farm tools, weapons.
And politically, it wasn't just trade, was it?
No, politically it was just as intricate. A complex dance, you could say, alliances, treaties, yes, but also conflict. Royal marriages were common, a way to cement alliances, create actual family ties between ruling houses across empires.
Marrying off daughters for peace deals.
Pretty much. Tribute payments, too, from vassal states to the big empires, showing the power hierarchy. And formal agreements, like that Kadesh Treaty between the Hittites and Egyptians we mentioned. These weren't simple handshakes. They had clauses on extradition, mutual defense, non-aggression pacts. It shows a really sophisticated understanding of international law, international relations, way more advanced than maybe we'd assume for that era.
So they built this complex equilibrium, but it sounds like it was resting on a knife's edge.
Exactly. An intricate but ultimately quite fragile foundation.
Okay, so that's the big picture, the empires, the trade, the diplomacy. But what about life within these societies? What did it look like for, say, an average person, or maybe a craftsman?
That's crucial, yeah, because the collapse hit everyone, top to bottom. These Bronze Age societies were deeply layered, very hierarchical. At the top, you had incredibly powerful aristocratic classes, kings, nobles, military commanders, owning vast lands, holding immense power, living in those grand palaces, controlling wealth. Alongside them, influential priestly castes. They managed religious rituals, sure, but they also often held huge economic and political power. They administered temple lands, temple treasury.
Temples as economic engines.
Absolutely. Major institutions, storing grain, overseeing craft production, managing labor forces, big players. And then you had the specialists. Highly skilled artisans, craftsmen, the metalworkers making the bronze, potters, weavers creating intricate textiles, jewelers working gold and gems. These weren't hobbyists. Their skills were vital. They often worked directly for the palace or the temple, making luxury goods for the elite, but also essential tools for everyday life. We find their workshops, their tools, evidence of amazing craftsmanship.
And the cities themselves.
Yeah. Typically fortified. Massive walls, which tells you something about the need for defense, right? Protecting people, protecting valuable resources. These walls were serious defensive structures. Religious buildings, temples, shrines. They were central to daily life. Places for worship, community gatherings, sometimes economic activity, too.
And writing. You mentioned Linear B.
Yeah, written culture was highly developed, not just for palace admin, used for laws, too. Building on this long tradition in the region of codified law, like Hammurabi's Code much earlier, showing that concept was well established. Writing was also used for literature, hymns, myths, extensive record keeping. It really marks the Bronze Age as this peak of human organization, cultural achievement, a world of seemingly stability, hierarchy, innovation.
Yeah.
But, with those vulnerabilities simmering underneath.
Okay, so this complex, interconnected world, seemingly stable, starts to fall apart around 1200 BCE. And one of the big dramatic factors everyone points to in the sources are these sea peoples.
Mhm.
But who actually were they? The name itself, sea peoples, sounds so mythical, like something out of an epic poem. What do the sources really tell us?
It's a great question because sea peoples is itself a kind of modern label, right? Coined mostly from those ancient Egyptian records. And what's fascinating is they weren't a single group, not one unified nation. That name is a bit misleading. Modern research, mainly based on Egyptian hieroglyphs, particularly from Ramesses II, and even more so from Ramesses III at his Medinet Habu temple, suggests they were this diverse confederation. Different ethnic groups, different cultural origins, all sort of banded together.
So the Egyptians saw them as one threat, but listed different groups.
Exactly. They listed several distinct names. Some key ones our sources mention are the Paliset. They're often linked pretty strongly, actually, to the Philistines who later settled in Palestine. Archaeology backs this up, like with distinctive pottery styles.
Okay, Peliset, Philistines maybe. Who else?
Then you have the Shurdana. Theories about them range from southwestern Anatolia to maybe even Sardinia, way out west in the Med. Their horned helmets in Egyptian pictures look a bit like figures found in Sardinia.
Sardinia, wow, that's far.
It is, suggests how widespread these movements might have been. Then there are the Luca, generally thought to be from western Anatolia, maybe Lycia. They were known seafarers, mentioned even earlier in Hittite texts. And the Shekelesh, another interesting one, possibly linked to Sicily, or maybe the area around Tunisia, again, pointing towards the western or central Mediterranean.
So they could have come from all over the place. Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, Italy, North Africa.
That's the picture emerging. Various nomadic groups, maybe from the Balkans too, the broader northern Med. It's less a single invasion force, more like widespread, complex population movements happening simultaneously. Understanding this mix of origins is really key to grasping the nature of the threat.
So structurally, they were totally different from the big empires they were attacking. No fixed territories, no big palaces, no complex bureaucracy. They sound more fluid, almost like restless tribes on the move.
Precisely. That's a crucial distinction. Their social structures were likely much more tribal, maybe clan-based, organized very differently from the centralized states they hit. Their whole way of life seems intertwined with seafaring and warfare. That made them adaptable, formidable opponents. Leadership probably came from a warrior elite.
And their mobility, that must have been key.
Absolutely. Unlike the settled states, tied down by their cities, their farms, their infrastructure, these sea peoples were highly mobile, often nomadic, maybe semi-nomadic. This let them move fast, effectively, across huge distances, strike coastal targets, then vanish or regroup quickly. This flexibility was a huge advantage against the more rooted Bronze Age empires, who struggled to respond to such a nimble, widespread threat.
It's like their lack of settled roots became their strength in this chaotic period.
You could definitely see it that way.
But why? What pushed these diverse groups to suddenly embark on these massive destructive movements? It can't just be random wanderlust or a sudden desire for plunder, can it? There must have been deeper reasons.
No, you're absolutely right. It wasn't random. Our sources point to a whole confluence of factors, a perfect storm, really, pushing these groups into motion, creating the conditions for mass migration and conflict. And chillingly, they might be one of the first major examples we have of, well, climate refugees.
Climate change. Back then.
Definitely. Paleoclimatic data from ice cores, tree rings, lake sediment strongly suggests a prolonged period of severe drought and cooling. Across the eastern Mediterranean, late 13th, early 12th centuries BCE, we're talking maybe 50, maybe 100 years of significantly less rainfall, lower average temperatures.
That would devastate farming.
Absolutely. Dramatically reduced crop yields, leading to widespread, repeated famines in their home regions. Food shortages directly fuel population movements. People get desperate. They have to move to survive. Add to that things like soil erosion from trying to farm drier land, less water available. It just makes the food crisis worse.
Yeah.
Huge social, economic strain pushing them outwards.
Okay, so climate change is a big push factor. What else?
Significant economic hardship. Maybe existing trade routes got disrupted perhaps by early skirmishes or unrest in their own areas, makes it hard to get essential goods, creates scarcity. This economic instability could easily push groups to look elsewhere for resources, even if it means raiding richer settled lands.
Makes sense. Desperation.
Then possibly internal strife. Political chaos, maybe civil wars within their own region. If life at home becomes unbearable because of conflict, moving out, even violently, might seem like the only option left. And finally, maybe external pressures. They might have been pushed out themselves by other groups, other migrations happening further inland, creating a kind of domino effect of displacement. So yeah, it's this complex mix, factors pushing them from their homelands, climate, hardship, war, and maybe pull factors too, the perceived wealth, or perhaps just the vulnerability of the big empires. They took to the sea, their main highway, and aimed for the coasts.
Okay, this is where it gets really dramatic, and honestly pretty terrifying to think about. These attacks by the Sea Peoples weren't just small raids, they were massive, seemingly organized, fast, and incredibly destructive. They hit hard in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. They became one of the most visible, most dramatic external forces in the Bronze Age collapse, a genuine cataclysm that helped wipe whole civilizations off the map.
And the most vivid direct accounts we have come from Egypt. Thanks to their amazing tradition of monumental inscriptions, detailed records, those reliefs at Ramesses III's temple at Medinet Habu, they're a historical treasure trove. Incredibly detailed carvings. They show huge warships, warriors with distinctive gear shields, helmets pitched battles against the Egyptian army both on land and at sea.
You can actually see the battle.
You can. The carvings show the chaos, the ferocity, the sheer scale of these invasions. Now, of course, Ramesses III portrays himself winning glorious victories.
Standard Pharaoh PR, right?
Exactly, necessary propaganda. But even these victories kind of mask the underlying reality. Egypt was being weakened by this persistent pressure, even if they held them off initially. The very fact a pharaoh needed to boast so loudly about defeating this enemy tells you how serious the threat was perceived to be. These records are invaluable, giving us this rare glimpse into the chaos, even if it's through that royal filter.
What about the other big players? Like the Hittites in Anatolia, Egypt's big rival. Did they face a similar onslaught? How did they hold up?
The Hittite Empire.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had dominated Anatolia for centuries. They took a catastrophic hit. Archaeology at their capital, Hattusa, shows these extensive destruction layers right around 1200 BCE. It points to a sudden, violent end for what was this huge, formidable imperial center, widespread burning, collapsed buildings, signs of rapid abandonment.
So the Sea Peoples got them too.
Well, Sea People's attacks, especially from groups like the coastal Luca, were definitely a major factor. But the Hittite collapse probably wasn't just them. The sources suggest these external attacks hit at a time when the empire was already struggling internally. Political instability, maybe succession fights, weakening control over their vassals.
And maybe the drought hit them hard too, affecting food supplies.
Very likely. Grain shortages would have weakened their ability to feed the army, the population. So it's this combination. External attacks, hitting existing internal weaknesses. It led to the empire just fragmenting, disappearing from history, left a huge power vacuum in Anatolia.
A classic case of an external shock pushing over something already unstable. And the Mycenaeans. Back in Greece. The heartland of early Greek civilization, those palaces, Linear B, the warrior kings, did they collapse too?
Oh, catastrophically. The Mycenaean centers, Mycenae itself, Pylos, Tiryns, they suffered this sudden, devastating collapse. Archaeological digs across Greece consistently show these widespread destruction layers. Evidence of huge fires, dated squarely in the early 12th century BCE. Their sophisticated palace centers, the hubs of their administration, economy, politics. They just crumbled, often burned to the ground, never rebuilt to their former scale. It wasn't just damage, it was often obliteration.
And Linear B vanished.
Completely. Their writing system, vital for that centralized bureaucracy, gone, disappears from use. And that's not just losing a script, it signals a total breakdown of their government, their economic management, societal amnesia, almost.
Was it just the Sea Peoples hitting the coasts?
The Sea Peoples were definitely a factor, coastal raids, disrupting trade that would have been crippling, but the evidence also points strongly towards severe internal conflicts playing a huge role, maybe even the decisive one.
Internal conflicts. Like civil wars.
Possibly. We find evidence of defensive measures being taken within cities, suggesting threats weren't just external, maybe aristocratic infighting, maybe peasant uprisings due to famine, plus the economic problems. It all fed into a systemic failure. It wasn't just an outside blow. It was like an implosion, perhaps accelerated by those external pressures. And even the Phoenicians, right, the maritime experts on the Levant coast, even they weren't immune.
Oh. I thought they might have weathered it better, being seafarers themselves.
Some of their key cities, like Ugarit, were utterly destroyed in this period, wiped out. That definitely disrupted their trade, caused population shifts. But, and this is testament to their resilience, others managed to survive. They adapted. And remarkably, some even thrived in the aftermath, in the new world that emerged. It's fascinating. Their ability to recover, to reinvent themselves, maybe their less centralized structure helped. Anyway, the Phoenician trading fleets actually emerged later as a dominant naval power in the Iron Age. They mastered the seas again, established new routes, really reshaped Mediterranean trade in the following centuries. So, yeah, devastation for some, but ultimately remarkable resilience and adaptability for the Phoenicians as a whole. A bit of a unique case in the collapse story.
Okay, so you've mentioned this a few times. The Sea Peoples weren't the only reason. The sources really push us to look deeper. Feels like blaming everything on these raiders is too simple. It sounds like there were all these underlying problems making these great civilizations vulnerable, making the Sea Peoples almost like a symptom, or maybe the final straw rather than the sole cause.
Exactly. This is where we have to connect it all, look at the bigger picture, move beyond that single dramatic cause, and see the profound complexity. Modern science, archaeology, paleoclimatology, even analysis of ancient texts reveals this devastatingly complex interplay. Internal pressures, external pressures, all converging at the same time. Some historians call it a systems collapse.
Systems collapse, like multiple critical parts failing all at once.
Precisely, leading to this catastrophic domino effect. Let's break down those factors. First, as we touched on, overwhelming evidence for climate change and major environmental factors. That paleoclimate data, ice cores, tree rings, sediments, shows that prolonged period of severe drought and cooling. Late 13th, early 12th centuries BCE.
Right, the drought causing famine.
Yes, drastically reduced rainfall, lower temperatures, leading to widespread recurrent famines across the whole region. This fuels population movements, desperate migrations, adds soil erosion, less water. The food crisis becomes immense. When the very foundation food is threatened, the whole structure becomes unstable.
Okay, climate change is number one. What else?
Secondly, the destructive role of natural disasters. Archaeology shows synchronous destruction layers from earthquakes and fires at many sites.
It's not just one city, but a pattern.
A pattern across the region, yeah. Especially in seismically active zones like Anatolia, the Aegean. These weren't minor tremors. Major earthquakes could topple those massive city walls, destroy infrastructure. Imagine a city already stressed by famine, maybe internal unrest, then bam, a huge earthquake hits. It accelerates the breakdown of social structures, central authority, weakens them fatally. A natural disaster can be the final blow to an already weakened society.
Makes sense. Climate, earthquakes. What's third?
Third, a profound economic crisis and the collapse of those trade networks. We talked about the reliance on long-distance trade for tin and copper.
Yeah.
When those routes get disrupted by conflict, by instability, maybe by the sea peoples themselves initially, access to these vital materials just dries up.
No tin, no copper,
Yeah.
no bronze.
Exactly. No tools, no weapons. Production grinds to a halt. The entire sophisticated trade network breaks down. It's an economic shock on a massive scale. This economic destabilization fuels social conflict. Rulers can't pay armies, artisans lose work, peasants starve. It spurs more population movement as people flee economic ruin.
Okay, so climate, disasters, economic collapse. Number four.
Fourth, widespread social and political upheaval within the empires. As central authorities struggled with famine, economic crisis, external threats, their grip weakened. Those rigid aristocratic structures started to disintegrate. This likely led to internal wars, local warlords fighting over dwindling resources. And there's evidence, though sometimes indirect, for peasant uprisings, class conflicts. The lower classes, facing starvation, maybe abandoned by their rulers, could rise up.
So internal conflict weakening them from the inside.
Critically, an empire fighting itself is fatally undermined. It makes them much more vulnerable to external attacks, whether from sea peoples or anyone else.
Right. And
Finally, those sea peoples' movements themselves were part of a broader picture of migrations and population shifts across the entire region. This suggests the sea peoples might have been pushed out of their own homelands by some of these same factors: climate, scarcity, conflict. These migrations, whether it's the named sea peoples or other groups we don't have records for, created immense pressure on existing populations, led to displacement, formation of new groups, new political orders eventually, a whole domino effect of human movement and instability across the map.
wow. So yeah, definitely not just one domino. A whole row, all interconnected, all falling. That's a terrifying cascade. It paints such a more nuanced picture than just barbarians destroyed civilization. It's almost like the very thing that made the Bronze Age great, that interconnectedness became its biggest weakness. One crack, and the whole system comes down.
Absolutely. That interconnectedness, that reliance, amplified the vulnerabilities. The collapse wasn't a single event. It was a complex process, a systems failure on a grand scale. The Sea Peoples were a brutal symptom, a powerful catalyst, yes, but the conditions for collapse were already deeply embedded within the system itself.
So, to piece together this incredibly complex puzzle, historians, archaeologists, they rely on all sorts of evidence, right? Written records, physical remains.
Yeah.
These are the silent witnesses telling the story, sometimes directly, sometimes, I guess, through what's missing. What kind of specific evidence are we talking about?
That's right. The evidence is absolutely key, and it comes from different angles. Looking at Egyptian records, for instance, beyond those amazing Medinet Habu reliefs from Ramesses III.
Yeah, the battle scenes.
There are various papyri, too. They give more written accounts of the Sea People's attacks and just the general chaos of the time. Papyrus Harris I, for example, mentions Ramesses III's struggles against foreign invaders, implicitly including them. We also have administrative documents from places like Deir el-Medina, that village where the tomb builders lived, detailing things like grain shortages, labor strikes during this period, gives us a glimpse into the internal pressures Egypt was facing.
So texts confirming the turmoil.
Exactly. Crucial textual evidence, even if, it's often got that official spin. They're the contemporary voices right from the middle of the crisis. Then you have the findings from Anatolian and Aegean excavations. The physical evidence here is maybe even more compelling. It's direct, it's raw. At major sites, the Hittite capital Hattusa, Mycenaean, places like Mycenae, Tiryns, pilot archaeologists consistently find these distinct destruction layers, dated right to the early 12th century BCE.
Destruction layers, what does that look like on the ground?
It looks like thick layers of ash, scorched earth, burned timbers from collapsed roofs, clear evidence of massive fires, and signs of sudden abandonment. Skeletons sometimes found in the destruction debris. It's not subtle, it's a violent break in the archaeological story. And often these cities weren't immediately reoccupied, or if they were, it was on a much smaller, poorer scale. Shows profound, lasting devastation.
And the cultural shifts.
Yeah, profound changes follow these destructions. The most striking, as we said, is the disappearance of Linear B in the Mycenaean world. Vanished.
The end of their bureaucracy.
Total collapse of their centralized system. When the writing used to manage everything disappears, it signals systemic failure at the highest level. We also see changes in pottery styles, simpler, more localized forms often replace the fancy imported wares. Changes in burial customs, architecture, reflecting disruption, and eventually new cultural identities emerging.
And over in the Levant and Cyprus.
Similar stories. In the Levant, remains in key port cities like Ugarit show trade routes were severed. Luxury imported goods just stop appearing in the layers. Local, coarser pottery takes over. Tells you the old economic networks just died. Led to the rise of new local powers. On Cyprus, we see new cultural elements emerging. New pottery styles, different burial practices, new types of metalwork, reflecting the impact of migrations, the mixing of populations, people moving, resettling, bringing traditions, mixing with locals, fundamentally reshaping the island's culture.
So all these different threads, texts, ruins, pottery, bones, they weave together a consistent picture of widespread catastrophe.
They really do. It's remarkably consistent across the region.
So the Bronze Age ends, not really with a bang, more like a series of crashes leaving this fragmented world. It's often called a dark age, right? Especially in Greece, a time of decline, loss. But eventually out of that chaos, a new era starts to emerge, the Iron Age. It feels like a testament to human resilience, doesn't it? Even after that level of destruction, societies rebuild, find new ways forward, even if they look completely different.
It absolutely is. That period, particularly in the Aegean, saw a huge decline in literacy, centralized control, hence the Dark Age label. But it was also a time of profound transformation, redefinition, a painful rebirth, often violent, but a rebirth nonetheless.
What characterized this new Iron Age? How is it different?
Well, several key things. One was the emergence of entirely new ethnic groups and cultures. We see the beginnings of peoples like the Hebrews in the Levant, whose story is tied to this post-collapse world. The Arameans spread across Syria, setting up small kingdoms. And critically, the seeds of the classical Greek city-states, the polis that would later define so much of Western civilization, they arise from the ashes of those Mycenaean palaces, new groups shaping the future in new ways.
So big empires replaced by smaller units.
Exactly. Those large, centralized Bronze Age empires with their vast territories and bureaucracies, they were replaced by smaller, often more fragile political entities. Kingdoms, city-states, a real decentralization of power. Changed warfare, diplomacy, economics, everything became more localized.
And literacy. You said Linear B vanished. Did writing come back?
There was a significant decline right after the collapse, Literacy became much rarer. But eventually, new, simpler writing systems developed. The Phoenician alphabet is the key example. Much more efficient, adaptable than the old complex scripts. Easier to learn, easier to use. It spread widely and paved the way for future literacy, influencing the Greek alphabet, then the Roman.
So a dark age, but then a new dawn for writing, too.
In a way, yes. And socioeconomically, those big palace economies, based on central control and redistribution, they gave way to more decentralized structures. Village life, local farming became more important. Self-sufficiency.
Wow.
Long-distance trade eventually revived, but on different terms. More localized, maybe more entrepreneurial merchants rather than state expeditions.
And at sea.
While the old powers faded, new players emerged. The Phoenicians, as we mentioned, became master mariners, forging new trade networks, new connections across the Med. So the transition took centuries, it was difficult, but it eventually led to new forms of society, new economies, laying the groundwork for the classical world that followed.
So looking back at this whole dramatic period, what are the big takeaways, the lasting lessons from this collapse, looking across 3,000 years?
I think it offers really invaluable insights. Firstly, into the inherent fragility of complex civilizations. It shows how even powerful, seemingly stable societies can unravel when hit by multiple pressures at once, even if no single pressure was enough on its own. It highlights the profound impact of human mobility, whether it's invasions or desperate migrations driven by climate or hardship. And it underscores the decisive role environmental factors can play. When climate change fundamentally undermines food production, even the strongest states are tested to their limits.
It feels very relevant.
It really does. It serves as this powerful historical case study. Shows that no civilization, however advanced, is immune to collapse, especially when its intricate interdependencies, the very things that made it prosperous, become liabilities. The breakdown of global systems, climate change impacts, mass migrations, these aren't just modern issues. They echo these ancient catastrophes. Hashtag outro.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems really clear. The Bronze Age collapse, roughly 1200 to 1100 BCE, it stands as one of the first truly major civilizational crises in world history. And it wasn't just about invasions, though they were devastating. It was this complex, multidimensional catastrophe, fueled by this cascade of failures. Climate change triggering famine, economic systems breaking down, widespread social and political chaos.
Absolutely. And while the Sea People certainly played that catalytic role, they triggered things, they made existing problems worse. It's so crucial to understand the fundamental factors were these breakdowns within the systems themselves. The regional system, the interconnected global system of the time. This whole process just powerfully demonstrates that big historical changes aren't simple. They're not just about military might or one single cause. They emerge from these intricate, interconnected dynamics, economic, environmental, social, cultural, all feeding into each other, creating that cascade effect that even the mightiest empires couldn't stop.
It's a stark reminder that interconnectedness, while it can bring prosperity, also creates vulnerability.
Exactly. It amplifies shocks through the system.
And modern history, modern archaeology, they keep shedding new light on this period, right? Giving us insights not just for understanding the ancient world, but maybe for understanding the models of how civilizations rise and how sometimes they fall. It feels like a powerful reminder that history might not repeat exactly, but it certainly rhymes.
Well put. The patterns are definitely there to study.
So the final question for you listening out there is, what does this all mean for us today? What insights can we really glean from an ancient collapse like the Bronze Age as we navigate our own incredibly interconnected and increasingly challenged global systems? We face our own versions of climate change, economic interdependence, population shifts. What hidden vulnerabilities might exist in our complex networks? Something to maybe mull over as you go about your day.